Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Hugney, and I'm a senior at East Longmeadow High School. I'm also president of our Key Club, and I can tell you that our Key Club is very excited to be presenting some virtual story time for some of the younger members in our community. So I hope everyone's staying safe, happy, and healthy. And today I will be reading Rip Van Winkle. So this is a very old story, and it's very dear to me because during the summers, I live in the Catskill Mountains in New York State. So that is the setting of Rip Van Winkle. And so the story of Rip Van Winkle is a very big part of life in the Catskill Mountains. For example, sometimes they host Rip Van Winkle statue carving contests. And everyone up there knows the story. I've heard this story many times, and I've loved it since I was a child. So I hope you all enjoy, and let's get started. So again, it's Rip Van Winkle. Anyone who has made a voyage along the Hudson River must remember the Catskill Mountains. Every shift of season, change in weather, and even the time of day alters these mountains in their hues and shapes. At the foot of these glorious mountains was a small village founded by Dutch colonists. Here lived a simple, good-natured man named Rip Van Winkle. Rip was a kind neighbor, an obedient, though henpecked husband. The children flocked to him, eager for him to teach them how to fly kites, shoot marbles, and join them in their sports and games. Even the dogs were charmed by Rip, never barking at him. So that's Rip right there. Rip's weakness, however, was that he was as disinclined to tend to his own household as he was eager to help his neighbors with their work. He was a great favorite, especially among the women, whose errands he was happy to run. His own farm was full of weeds and stones, and his cow often went astray. His children, too, were ragged and wild, wearing tattered clothing and generally resembling street urchins. Naturally, this enraged his wife, Dame Van Winkle, and as a result, Rip endured many a tirade. Rip's only escape from her wrath was to shrug his shoulders and quietly slip away. So this is Dame Van Winkle and his children. He frequented a small inn where he could sit in the shade on a lazy summer day, chatting about village gossip or telling endless stories about nothing in particular. There, Rip could smoke his pipe and join deep discussions about events past and present. During these peaceful gatherings, Dame Van Winkle would hunt him down and scold him before his company, accusing the men of encouraging her husband's idleness. No one was spared her reproach, and even the most dignified of Rip's friends endured her sharp tongue. One fine autumn day, Rip escaped his work and his wife by saying he was going hunting. He and his canine friend, Wolf, scrambled up to the highest part of the mountains. There he threw himself on a soft green knoll and gazed out at the lush countryside, dazzled by the amber clouds and the blue highlands. After a while, Rip began his descent back to the village. Then, in the distance, he heard a voice calling out, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He looked around, but he could see nothing. Again, the cry rang out, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" The hair on Wolf's back bristled, and he growled and skulked to his master's side. Rip looked anxiously in the direction of the voice. He saw a strange fellow coming up the mountainside, bending under a stout keg. The stranger was short and square-built, sporting bushy hair, a grizzled beard, and clothing of an ancient Dutch style. His keg was heavy, and he motioned for Rip to assist him with his load. Wary of his new acquaintance, Rip took up the keg and followed him through a narrow gully. Far away, Rip could hear long, rolling peals, like distant thunder, that seemed to come from a deep ravine. The two men climbed in silence to a hollow where looming trees nearly hid the fiery sky and bright evening clouds. At the center of the hollow, Rip saw a small company of odd-looking men playing ninepins. They were dressed in a quaint, outlandish style, with full beards of various shapes and lengths. Though the men were playing a lively and amusing game, they maintained the gravest faces in a mysterious silence. There was not a sound in the hollow except the noise of the balls crashing into the pins, echoing along the mountains like rumbling thunder. As Rip and his new acquaintance approached, the men stopped their game and stared at him with a statue-like gaze. So these are all the men playing ninepin there, and there you can see they're bowling, and so the crash of the ninepin is what's making the sounds like thunder. His companion poured a strong drink from the keg into large mugs and motioned to Rip to serve the company. Rip obeyed, trembling as he watched the men drink from their mugs and resume their game. His apprehension subsided, and when no one was looking, Rip slipped over to the keg to taste the beverage, which he found most delicious. As one taste led to the next, Rip felt his senses become overpowered. His eyes grew heavy, his head dipped down, and he fell into a deep sleep. So you can see, looks like he's having a good little nap there. Upon waking, Rip found himself on the green knoll where he had first met the old man. It was bright and sunny, and he rubbed his eyes thinking, "Surely I have not slept here all night." He vaguely recalled the prior night's events, the strange man, the keg of drink, and the shaded hollow where that silent company of men had been playing ninepins. "Oh, that drink! That wicked drink!" moaned Rip. "How shall I ever explain this to my wife?" Rip looked for his gun, but instead he found an old rusty rifle. He now suspected that those odd men had robbed him. He whistled for Wolf, but his call merely echoed. No dog was to be seen. You can see, if you take a close look at Rip, that he looks a little different. See if you can figure out what looks a little different about Rip here. Perplexed, Rip set off to revisit the hollow. As he stood, he felt weak and stiff in his joints. With some difficulty, he made his way towards the site of last evening's festivities. He retraced his steps from the night before, but to his surprise, a mountain stream flowed where the gully had been. He managed to scramble up the side of the glen, pushing through thickets and wild grapevines. Reaching the ravine, Rip saw no trace of the hollow. High rocks formed a massive wall over which a waterfall rushed. Rip was dumbfounded. He called again for his dog, but Wolf still did not come. What was he to do? Famished and grieving for his dog, he turned his steps homeward. Approaching the village, he saw a number of people, but none of them were familiar. They all stared at him, stroking their chins. Without thinking, Rip did the same, and was astonished to find that his beard had grown a foot long. In his confusion, Rip had not realized his own transformation. He entered the skirts of the village, where strange children pointed at him and laughed. Even the dogs barked at him as he passed. The village had grown greatly, and strange names were on signs over the doors. He wondered whether both he and the world around him had been bewitched. Surely this was his village that he had left the day before, he pondered. That drink last night, he thought, has addled my poor head. Rip found his way to his house, expecting at every moment to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle. A dog resembling Wolf slunk by and snarled. My own dog, sighed the poor Rip, has forgotten me. The house was empty and abandoned. The desolateness overcame him, and he called out for his family, but there was only silence. He hastened to his old refuge, the village inn, but it was gone. A crowd was gathered at the door, but Rip recollected no one. He noticed a man, a sort of politician, earnestly talking about liberty and the heroes of 1776. These terms had no meaning for Rip, and he stood there bewildered. He asked where his friends were, but each one had moved on or passed away. Rip felt completely alone. "Does anyone here know Rip Van Winkle?" he cried. A young woman came forward to see who was causing such a commotion. She carried a small child who cried, frightened by Rip's appearance. "Hush, little Rip, hush," she said. "This man won't hurt you." Her child's name, her air, and her voice awakened a train of memories in Rip's mind. "What was your father's name?" "Poor man," she sighed. "His name was Rip Van Winkle, but he went away 20 years ago and has never been heard from since." Faltering, Rip asked the young woman, "Where is your mother?" "Oh, she died a short time ago. She broke a blood vessel in a heated argument with a peddler." Rip could not contain himself. He embraced his daughter and her child and cried out, "Judith, I am your father. Don't you recognize me?" An old woman came out of the crowd. She peered at Rip's face and exclaimed, "It's Rip Van Winkle. Welcome home, old neighbor. Where have you been these past 20 years?" Rip told his story. Unconvinced, the crowd sought wise old Peter Vanderdonk, who knew all the history of the mountains. He corroborated Rip's story and assured the people that it was indeed known that the Catskill Mountains have always been haunted by strange beings. Henry Hudson, discoverer of this region, kept a kind of vigil upon the hollow every 20 years with his crew of the Half Moon. This way, Henry could still admire his river. Peter's own father had seen this company of men playing ninepins and had heard, one summer afternoon, the sound of their balls, like distant peals of thunder. Rip's daughter took him home to live with her family. Though a bit worn from the years, he enjoyed making friends with the younger generation, who considered him a great friend. Sitting on his bench, Rip was revered as an elder of the village. He could recall with great detail the times before the Revolutionary War. No longer fearful of his wife, Rip was free to go gather with his friends, spend the day fishing, or play with the neighborhood children. He told his story to every stranger who arrived in the village, and in time everyone knew it by heart, even to this day, because the villagers never hear a thunderstorm on a summer afternoon in the Catskills without remembering Henry Hudson and his crew playing their game of ninepins. So that's the end. I hope you all enjoyed both the story and the wonderful paintings here of the story. Indeed, the scenery is what it does look like in the Catskill Mountains. I know from experience, and I know when I hear thunder in the mountains, I always think of Henry Hudson and his crew playing ninepins. So that is Rip Van Winkle, and thank you so much for listening. Please stay safe, happy, and healthy, and take care.
So today I'm going to read you Little Red Riding Hood, retold and illustrated by Trina S. Heyman. For Mimi. Once upon a time there was a little girl named Elizabeth who lived with her mother in a house on the edge of a village. She was loved by all who knew her, but she was especially dear to her grandmother, who loved her more than anything in the world. One day the grandmother sewed a red velvet cloak with a hood and gave it to Elizabeth for her birthday. It looked so pretty, and she liked it so much that she would never wear anything else, and therefore everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. Early one morning, her mother said to her, "Come here, Red Riding Hood, and listen to me. I want you to take this loaf of fresh bread and some of this sweet butter and a bottle of wine to your grandmother. She is sick in bed, and they will do her a world of good. Go right away before the sun gets too hot. Promise me that you won't daydream and stray off the path, and don't run, or you will fall down and break the bottle. And then there will be no wine for grandmother. When you get there, please don't forget your manners. Say good morning, please, and thank you nicely without staring around about you or sucking your finger. Don't stay too long, or else you will tire grandmother. And when you have had a nice visit, come straight home." "Yes, Mamma," said Little Red Riding Hood. "I promise I will do just as you tell me." Now her grandmother lived in a cottage in the middle of the forest, a good half-hour's walk from the village. But Little Red Riding Hood knew the way, so she was not afraid to go by herself. When she had walked far enough into the woods to feel just a bit lonely, who should she meet but a sly and hungry old wolf? She had no idea what a wicked animal he was, however, so she was not at all frightened of him. "Good morning, Red Riding Hood," he said. "Good morning, Wolf," she answered politely. "Where are you off to so early in the day, my dear?" he asked. "I'm going to grandmother's. She is sick in bed, you know." "Is that so?" he murmured. "And what have you got in your basket?" "A loaf of bread, some sweet butter, and a bottle of wine. Mamma and I baked yesterday, so I'm taking a loaf to grandmother. It will do her a world of good. Now, isn't that nice? And where does your grandmother live, Little Red Riding Hood?" "Oh, it's a good 15 minutes further into the woods. Her house is the one by those 3 big oak trees right next to the blackberry hedge, and there's a stream running by her garden. Surely you know the place," said Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf thought to himself, "Aha, this tender little creature will be a plump morsel, a good dessert after the old woman. I must be clever about this so I can make a great meal out of the 2 of them." He walked along with Little Red Riding Hood for a while, making polite conversation. Then he said, "Just look at those beautiful wildflowers, Red Riding Hood. They are a sight even for my tired old eyes. For goodness sake, why don't you relax a bit? Look at the world and see how lovely it is. Why, I don't believe you hear the birds sing or enjoy the sunshine. You're just as solemn and well-behaved as you were going to school. Everything else is so gay and happy out in the forest." Then Little Red Riding Hood looked away from the path, and when she saw the sunlight dancing through the trees and the wildflowers and butterflies scattered throughout the ferns, she thought, "I'm sure that grandmother would feel happier if I took her a bunch of flowers. They are a sight for tired old eyes, I know. And it is still quite early in the day. I have plenty of time to pick them." So she excused herself, said goodbye to the wolf, and wandered off among the trees to pick flowers. Each time she picked one, she always saw another, even prettier, one further away. And so she left the path and went deeper and deeper into the forest. Meanwhile, the wicked wolf went straight off to the grandmother's cottage and knocked softly on the door. "Who's there?" called the grandmother from her bed. "It's me, Little Red Riding Hood," said the wolf in a tiny voice. "I brought you a loaf of bread, some sweet butter, and a bottle of wine. Let me in." "You'll have to lift the latch and let yourself in, dear," the grandmother called out. "I'm feeling too weak to get out of bed." So the wolf lifted the latch and opened the door. He ran straight to the bed. Without even saying a good morning, he ate up the poor old grandmother in one gulp. Then he put on a clean nightgown and shawl that were lying on the chair by the bedside. He got into the bed and pulled the bed curtains closer together. In the meantime, Little Red Riding Hood wandered here and there picking flowers until she had such an armful she could barely hold them all. Then she suddenly remembered her grandmother and the promise she had made her mother, so she found her way back to the path and walked straight to the cottage. When she got there, she was amazed to find the door open, and she tiptoed in. She felt quite frightened, but she didn't know why. "What's wrong?" she thought. "I always liked coming to grandmother so much. Why should I feel so afraid? Can it be because she's sick?" "Good morning, grandmother," she called, but there was no answer. When she went quietly into the bedroom and pulled the bed curtains back, there lay her grandmother. But she had drawn her shawl over her face, and she looked very odd. Red Riding Hood couldn't help but stare. "Grandmother, what big hairy ears you have grown," she said. "The better to hear you with, my dear." "Oh, grandmother, your eyes are so shiny, the better to see you with, my dear." "Your hands look so strange, grandmother, the better to catch you and hug you with, my dear." "Please, grandmother, why do you have such big, sharp teeth?" "Those are to eat you up with, my dear." As the wolf said this, he sprang out of bed and ate up poor Little Red Riding Hood. Then, having finished his first good meal in many weeks, that wicked wolf went back to bed, pulled the covers up, and soon was snoring as loudly as you can imagine. Not long after, a huntsman from the village happened to be passing by the grandmother's cottage. "By Jiminy," he thought, "the old lady is snoring much too loudly. Maybe I should stop in and see if there's anything the matter with her." So he went right into the house and up to the bed, where he saw the wolf fast asleep in the grandmother's nightgown and shawl with a fat stomach full to bursting. Right away the huntsman guessed what had happened. "So here you are, you old sinner," the huntsman said. "I've been looking for you all these years, and now this is where I find you." He raised his gun to shoot, but then he wondered if the wicked old wolf might have swallowed the grandmother whole, and if perhaps there was a chance she still might be saved. So he took out his knife and quickly killed the wolf while he lay sleeping. Then he carefully cut open the wolf's stomach. At the first cut, he saw the red velvet cloak, and after a few more slashes, a little girl jumped out and cried, "Oh, thank you! I was very frightened. It was so dark inside the wolf." Next, the grandmother climbed out, alive but hardly able to breathe from the fright and exhaustion. They thanked the huntsman with all their hearts, and he was so glad to see them both alive and well that he hugged Little Red Riding Hood and shook the grandmother's hand over and over again. They were all quite happy. The huntsman skinned the wolf and took the pelt home to nail on his door. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother sat down together to eat the fresh bread and sweet butter. The grandmother drank some of the wine, and Red Riding Hood had a cup of blackberry tea. After a while, the grandmother felt quite strong and healthy and began to clean up the mess that the wolf had left in the cottage. As Little Red Riding Hood walked home through the woods, she thought to herself, "I will never wander off the forest path again as long as I live. I should have kept my promise to my mother." She was comforted, though, that she had at least minded her manners and had always said, "Good morning, please, and thank you." Alrighty, the end. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.